Okay, let's dive in. Imagine, just for a moment, that the usual line we draw between living things, us, plants, bugs, and non-living things like a rock or metal, maybe that line isn't quite so clear-cut.
It's a pretty challenging idea, isn't it?
Hmm,
We tend to think of life as, well, biological, organic.
exactly. And that kind of counterintuitive thought is our starting point for this deep dive. We're cracking open an unfinished essay sketch by St. Coleridge, the poet and philosopher. It was published after he died back in 1848, edited by S. B. Watson.
That's right. The title is Hints Towards the Formation of a More Comprehensive Theory of Life. And our goal today is really to explore Coleridge's, let's say, unconventional take on what life actually is based on this text.
We want to follow his arguments, see where he takes us on this journey through nature.
And the editor, Watson, gives us a bit of a heads up right at the start.
Yeah, he does. He respects Coleridge's genius, clearly, but he's also pretty upfront that it's a sketch. He mentions a possible want of method and says he doesn't necessarily buy into Coleridge's widest claims.
Especially applying the word life to, rocks and chemicals. Watson preferred the common use human, animal, maybe vegetable life. He explicitly says Coleridge's theory doesn't cover spiritual life or the afterlife sense.
So Watson added his own introduction to sort of guide the reader through Coleridge's thinking.
Which is helpful. Now, Coleridge himself in this specific text is focusing on life, mainly as it relates to the body. He sets aside the sole reason, conscience, which he tackled elsewhere.
But even just focusing on the physical, he really goes after that standard division between living and non-living.
He absolutely does. He starts by sort of tearing down how others tried to define life. He really takes the conventional definitions to task.
So what were the problems he saw?
Well, first, the abstract definitions, like saying life is just the sum of functions that resist death.
Okay.
Coleridge thought, hang on, it's too abstract. It's like just wording the term life, not actually defining the thing itself, the underlying principle.
Right, it tells you what happens, but not what it is.
Exactly. Then he looks at definitions based on specific functions, like, say, nutrition or assimilation.
That sounds more concrete.
More concrete, maybe, but he argues they're way too narrow. They might apply to the simplest organisms, maybe, but not broadly. And more importantly, he says they assume the very split between living and lifeless that he wants to question.
It's circular reasoning then.
Pretty much. And he points out that the logical error, cum hoc, ergo propter hoc. Just because nutrition happens with life doesn't mean nutrition is life or causes it.
Like saying the shell is the snail.
Precisely. He feels these definitions mistake a process or a symptom or a specific form life takes for the fundamental law or idea of life itself. They miss the why.
And he wasn't a fan of the idea that life is just about how atoms are arranged either, the sort of mechanical view.
No, not at all. He called that the corpuscular philosophy. He basically dismissed atoms, as conceived then, as mere abstractions of the mind. For him, and this is really key, life isn't a thing. It's not a result of particles clicking together. It's an act, a process. It's dynamic.
Okay, so if it's not those things, what is his big idea? What's the core of his comprehensive theory?
He puts it forward as a hypothesis. He says life is the principle of individuation.
Individuation, meaning becoming an individual.
Exactly. It's a power that kind of discloses itself from within. It works to unite lots of different qualities or properties into one single distinct individual thing. It creates a whole that's somehow more fundamental than its parts or presupposed by them.
The drive to become a unique one.
Yeah.
Okay. And what drives that? Is there a general law behind this tendency?
Yes. And this is probably his most famous concept here, polarity.
Polarity, like north and south.
Kind of, but much broader. He calls it the essential dualism of nature. It's this fundamental tension, this opposition that springs from a deeper unity, but always seeks to reaffirm that unity. It's a constant push and pull.
Like you see in philosophy, finite, infinite, true, false, good, devil, those kinds of opposites.
That's the kind of fundamental duality he's talking about, yeah. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. He connects this polarity directly to, well, magnetism, electricity, and chemistry.
Wait, the actual physical forces.
Yes. He doesn't see them as totally separate things. He sees them as cooperating powers, where one tends to predominate in different expressions or modifications of life.
So not just metaphors, he thinks these physical forces are actually involved in the vital processes.
Fundamentally involved. And he even links them to dimensions based on the physics of his day. Magnetism, he says, acts fundamentally in a line, in length. Electricity acts on a surface, and chemistry acts in depth, like a solid.
Okay, Length, surface, depth. How does he connect those physical ideas to actual life processes?
Well, this is the core of the hypothesis. Magnetism, acting in length, predominates in reproduction. Electricity, acting on the surface, predominates in irritability. It's the basic capacity to respond to stimuli, which develops into sensibility via nerves.
And chemistry. In depth.
Chemistry, or what he calls constructive affinity, acting in depth, predominates in sensibility itself. The big idea is that these forces we think of as purely physical, MEC, are maybe lower forms or steps of the very same power that manifests as life.
Wow. Okay. So the forces shaping rocks are somehow foundational to, say, animals, just
Yeah.
expressed differently. How does he trace this unfolding? Is it like a
He
ladder?
uses that exact metaphor. Nature ascends like steps in a ladder, he says, but also expands like concentric circles. It's a progression from simplicity towards complexity and greater individuation.
Where does this letter start? At the very beginning.
He talks about chaos, but not necessarily as a historical moment, more like a symbol of vast homogeneous fluid. It represents that initial state of pure potential, the strife between indifference and difference, before distinct things emerge.
And the first step out of that chaos is,
Magnetism. He calls it the first and simplest differential act of nature. It works in length, creating the very first distinction. Its poles represent these basic oppositions: rest, attraction, fixity, carbon on one side of the earth, and mobility, repulsion, incoherence, azote or nitrogen on the other, the south.
and in the physical world, this corresponds to.
Metals. He sees metals as the simplest forms of unity. They're indecomposable, a basic unity of powers or properties. That's the first rung.
Okay, metals. What's next up?
Crystals. They're the simplest forms of totality. Not just a unified point or line, but a union of parts creating a definite form based on their inner quality.
And from crystals, we start moving towards what we normally think of as life.
Yeah, the third step involves these tendencies to vegetation or animalization, but he still sees them as deeply connected to the geological and mineral processes below them.
And plants and animals are like opposite expressions in his system.
Very much so. Vegetation is where magnetism predominates, strongly expressed as reproduction, with carbon being the key element. Animal life, on the other hand, is where electricity gets intensified, expressed as irritability, with azote or nitrogen prevailing. Opposite poles, definitely.
Okay, so within the animal kingdom itself, how does this individuation thing progress? Does it get stronger?
Absolutely. He starts down with things like polyps and corals. Individuality there is in its first dawn, he says. You have this mass of near-identical units making up a sort of common animal. Forms are indistinct, reproduction is just budding off cuttings. It's, very weak individuation, but massive reproduction. Magnetism reproduction is still really dominant.
Right, barely individuals. Where does it get clearer?
Then you get the mollusca, snails, mussels, things like that. Here, the individuals are clearly separate. They have more definite shapes. You start seeing hints of nerves, of sensibility, but it's still mostly in service of reproduction. They're also kind of transitional between fluid and solid states, and the carbon principle still links them back towards plants.
Okay, then we get to insects. He sounds quite excited about them. Intenser life.
Yeah, flori liberti et libertini, like the freedmen of the flowers. He sees insects as emancipated from that vegetative link. They have distinct muscular and nervous systems, but the muscular system irritability, linked to electricity, is dominant. Their life is lived at extra, he says, on the surface.
Which fits the electricity surface idea.
Exactly. High reproduction, yes, but those amazing metamorphoses they go through still echo plant transformations. Insects are kind of the peak expression of irritability for him.
Fascinating. What comes after insects?
Fishes. Now we start seeing internal bones, even if they're just gristle at first. And sensibility really begins to awaken. He calls it the consummation of the fluid principle. They get distinct senses like smell and single movable eyes. Still, lots of reproduction measured by weight. And he knows how length predominates in their shape and movement, which sort of loops back towards magnetism.
So these powers aren't just switched on and off, they're being integrated and balanced differently.
That's the idea. They don't vanish, the balance shifts. Next up, birds. He sees them as a kind of synthesis of fish and insects. Irritability is still strong, but sensibility is much more awake, even if subordinate. Think of their complex songs, their tendency towards articulation, their building and migratory instincts.
And their structure.
Bones are hollow, their feathers are like an actual vegetation on their exterior. Their whole tendency seems more ad intra, inward, compared to the surface life of insects.
And then we reach the top of the pyramid.
Mammalia, and ultimately man. In mammals, you get the fully developed nervous system. Sensibility takes its proper highest rank, Bones are solid, filled in, body coverings are simpler, and man stands at the apex.
The microcosm.
Right. The organic power is mainly inward, centripetal. Man contains a world within, mirroring the world without. Individuation, which started way back with a simple unity of metals, is perfected corporeally here.
And it goes beyond just the physical body.
Yes, it extends into self-awareness, self-reference, sovereignty. And even here, at the peak, polarity is still at work. Liberty versus law, independence versus service, genius versus sympathy with nature. True, full life exists in finding that conciliating midpoint.
That is quite a structure, an incredibly interconnected view from symbolic chaos up to human consciousness, all driven by polarity and individuation. Did he try to back this up? Especially the link between the physical forces and the life processes? Any, experimental evidence?
He clearly felt it was important. He argues that the dimensions he assigned, length, surface, depth, really do correspond to the observed actions of magnetism, electricity, and chemistry, and he points to specific experiments.
Okay, like what?
Well, for magnetism and length, he mentions experiments by Brugmans and Coulomb. They apparently show that magnetic influence travels along the length of an object and increases with length. Even if you put an iron bar sideways in a magnetic field, the poles appear at the ends of its length.
So, evidence for magnetism and length. What about electricity and surface?
He points to standard physics demonstrations, like using gold leaf on charged objects. The experiments showed that electrical charge resides almost entirely on the surface of a conductor.
Got it. And chemistry in depth, that seems harder to show.
His reasoning there is that chemical changes, composition, decomposition, always involve changes in specific gravity in density. And he argues that gravity is the essential inward quality of inorganic things. It's what constitutes their depth.
Okay, so he uses these observations to argue. Magnetism is the power of length, linked to reproduction. Electricity is the power of surface, linked to irritability. And the power of depth, shown by chemistry gravity, is linked to sensibility.
That's the framework he builds. He's arguing these aren't just weird coincidences. They show fundamental kinds of power manifesting at different levels, from minerals right up to us.
Now, the source itself brings up criticisms, right?
Yeah.
From a Mr. Lawrence. What kind of things were people objecting to?
Yeah, there were definitely pushbacks. Things like, why do vital properties need some special explanation if we don't demand one for, say, gravity itself? Some mocked the comparison, saying life is based on an MEC is like saying it's based on a camel or a whale, just arbitrary.
Okay, that's a bit dismissive.
Right. Others doubted the existence of those vague, fine fluids that were sometimes used in older theories, though Coleridge also rejected those. They pointed out correctly that magnetism and electricity are actually quite different phenomena.
Which seems like a problem for his unity idea.
And some ridiculed the direct application, like asking if your brain is a magnet or your muscles are Leyden jars.
Yeah, those sound like fair points from a more, let's say, conventional scientific view. How did Coleridge, or Watson editing him, respond to all that?
They defended the method first, saying it's valid to illustrate complex things, like life, by using simpler, better understood things, like MEC. But the key clarification they make is that it's not meant as a simple comparison. It's not life is like a magnet.
Okay, so what is it then?
It's about showing MEC as lower forms or earlier steps in a continuous process of generation. Think of how you generate a line from a point or a surface from a line. It's that kind of relationship, a development, not just a similarity.
Ah, a genetic link, not just an analogy.
Exactly. And they double down on rejecting finer fluids as explanations for it. Coleridge wasn't relying on those either. As for M&E being different, they say yes, that difference is essential to the system. The polarity needs distinct poles to function.
So the difference isn't a bug, it's a feature.
Right. And they argue that higher animal life, especially human life, isn't just like MEC. It's the point where the identity of all three powers is finally achieved and unified.
And they had something to say about the word analogy itself, too.
Yeah, they clarified what they mean by analogy.
Yeah.
It's about achieving the same end through different means.
Yeah.
Like gills and lungs both achieve respiration, but the structures are different. If MEC are actually the same underlying power just at different stages, then they aren't merely analogous to life in that sense. They're part of its fundamental constitution, its generation.
Makes sense. And there was a quick mention of someone else, Abernethy, having similar ideas.
Just a brief note, yeah. Acknowledging that another scientist of the time, Mr. Abernethy, seemed to have a presentiment of similar connections between physics and life, suggesting Coleridge wasn't totally alone in thinking along these lines.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. Coleridge's big hypothesis is Life is the dynamic connection, the copula that unites reproduction, irritability, and sensibility.
Right.
And he sees these life functions as higher expressions of fundamental physical powers. Length or magnetism for reproduction, surface or electricity for irritability, and depth or constructive chemistry for sensibility.
And these physical powers are themselves just lower forms, earlier steps of the same universal vital power.
Right.
Life is this positive universal principle, but it gets shaped and individualized in each creature by a kind of negative limiting principle.
And crucially, it's always an act, a process unfolding, not a static thing, and distinct from the soul.
That's the core of it.
It's such an ambitious, maybe even mystical, but deeply interconnected way of seeing everything, stretching life way beyond biology, seeing nature as this ascending series driven by polarity and this push towards individuation.
I think the key things to take away are life is individuation, the principle of polarity being fundamental everywhere, and this really radical connection he draws between basic life functions, reproduction, irritability, sensibility, and those physical forces, magnetism, electricity, chemistry, seeing them as different rungs on the same ladder, essentially.
And always remembering that for him, life is dynamic, an act, a process, not just a thing.
It definitely pushes you to look for connections, for unity, in places you might usually just see division, even between the living and the supposedly non-living.
It really does. It makes you see the world perhaps as less fragmented. And maybe the final thought to leave you with, coming straight from Coleridge's text, is this fascinating idea about how nature learns and grows. He says nature never loses what she has once learned.
Yeah, even if a faculty seems to disappear in one form of life.
She never fails to pick it up again. She might seem forgetful and absent, but it's only to recollect herself with additional as well as recruited vigor in some after and higher state.
And the text suggests maybe the sleep of powers, were the season and condition of their growth.
Just think about that for a bit. What if periods that look like dormancy or even regression aren't failures? What if they're actually necessary phases, the season, needed for a stronger, more complex emergence later on, whether that's in nature or maybe even in our own lives or societies? Something to definitely chew on.